Demons to some, angels to others.
This podcast will tear your soul apart.
Welcome to Spooky 30s, a podcast where I, Stella Cheeks, a 30-something of questionable taste, invite my friends on to turn me into the horror-obsessed fangirl I look like but never was. Each episode, my special guest picks a horror property that I just have to know. We watch it, read a bunch of cultural criticism, both peer-reviewed and publicly published, praise be to the internet scholars and the Tumblr historians, and then we have, hopefully, a super interesting conversation for your ear holes. My special guest this month is a writer, podcaster, and the internet's preeminent fancaster, Elle Collins.
Hey, I'm so glad to be here. I mean, I think you know that I immediately contacted you after the first episode. I was like, I want to be on this podcast.
I don't even know if it was like the first episode. I think as I released the fan art and you were like, you're having me on, right? And I was like, yeah, of course. You're on the top of the list. So how do we know each other? What is our relationship?
Well, I was about to say we both used to be wrestling podcasters, but technically you are again.
Technically, I still am.
But we, with our friends Megan and Aaron used to each co-host a queer feminist wrestling podcast. And there were, like 3 or 4 of those. And we didn't get along with the people that made the other ones. So we became friends.
Yeah. People talk about how Twitter is accessible. And that's true. But Twitter can also be a magical place where you make friends. So Twitter's still pretty cool. I have to tell you, I was listening to one of my playlists the other day and that grime song that you used to use for your theme song came on. And I still out loud always go, you don't know what hard times are. So that has always stuck
I'm
in my
glad
head.
that's infected everyone's brain that used to listen to Hard Times.
So why did you want to be on this podcast? Like, what other than that, we're like really good friends and we both love to podcast.
Yes,
but like,
there is that.
Yeah, what's your relationship to the horror genre? Why do you want to talk about this?
Well, I am a big horror fan. I have a hard time putting a timeline to it because I was a pretty scared kid. Like I wasn't one of those kids who was like watching like real horror movies when I was 8 years old. But I got into like old horror movies first. Like I got into like Dracula and Frankenstein and all of that. And then as I got older and then had access to more movies, I started watching more recent horror movies. There was definitely a time in high school when I was a regular Fangoria reader.
That tracks.
Yeah. And, I've just always really enjoyed horror. And as soon as I found out that you were doing this horror podcast, I was like, yes, I definitely. And I've gotten like more or like back into horror in a big way since like the pandemic. So like the last, 2 full years. There's
something about being stuck in your house and like having this societal claustrophobia that it's just like, I guess I'll watch horrifying things all the time. It can't be worse than what I'm living through.
Yeah. I went through these like phases at the beginning of the pandemic when like, quarantine and all that started. Like at first I just wanted to watch like really comforting things like Agatha Christie shows on BritBox.
Mm-hmm.
And then after it was still going on after like 2 months, like something shifted in my brain where I wanted to watch the most violent and disturbing things I could find.
Yeah.
And I've pretty much been there ever since.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the birth of this podcast. I was like a big baby, didn't want to watch anything. And then through the isolation, I kept stumbling across horror properties and being like, I actually really like this. Old me would have been really scared. And then waking up and being like, I actually think I just like horror now. I think something happened. So what are we going to talk about today? What did you pick?
We are going to talk about Hellraiser. Specifically, we're going to talk about the first 2 movies, Hellraiser, Hellbound, Hellraiser 2, and then also the novella Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker that the first movie is based on.
Yeah, when you first suggested it, I sent you in the email and was like, this is kind of how the podcast is forming because this is only our 4th episode. And I was like, I tend to go crazy and watch it all and read it all. And you specifically were like, I get that impulse, but I think that you should only watch the first 2 movies. You can watch the other ones later, but for the purpose of this discussion, I think you should only watch the first 2 movies. And I am so happy that you suggested that. We'll get into it more, but having watched them and done a bunch of readings about them and process them. I am really happy that you suggested that for this podcast, so it can be a little bit, so we don't have to talk about 10 movies. That would have been
like 8
impossible.
of which are terrible.
Yeah. But also because I think it helps us keep on track with the like Clive Barker view specifically, but also because it feels like the tone shifts so completely after 2 to 3 that I was telling you before we started recording, I don't think I ever want to watch any of the other movies. Like, I like where my fandom of this property exists right now. I don't think I ever want to watch anymore.
Well, as I think I explained to you in an email, there is some good stuff in the third movie. It definitely like ruins a lot of what's cool about the mythology, but it has Jadzia Dax and lesbian subtext, and there's some worthwhile stuff in it, but it's just not a good Hellraiser movie. In fact, and I'm sure we'll get into this more, but rewatching the first two, which I actually rewatched them twice for this podcast, once when we first talked about it, and then again in the past week. And I came to realize that there's a lot of stuff that I feel like kind of gets fucked up in the second movie compared to the first. But the second kind at least has a lot of like interesting world building and visuals, and and it still has like Kirsty and Julia, who kind of make it worthwhile.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that.
The box. You opened it. We came.
It's just a puzzle box!
Oh no. It is a means to summon us.
Okay, so before we do our deep dive, I will do a little movie synopsis via Shudder, because I hate writing my own synopsis for people who have, for some reason, never seen these movies but want to listen to this podcast. Shout out to those listeners. So this is the movie synopsis for the 1987 Hellraiser movie. A puzzle box reveals a realm of sadistic monsters led by a being named Pinhead, who tortured the depraved man who unlocks it. Escaping Pinhead's wrath, what remains of Frank hides out in his attic until a chance encounter leads him to enlist his brother's wife, Julia, whom he had a passionate affair, to lure victims home so Frank can feed on their blood. Clive Barker's essential 80s classic offered audiences weary of slashers a thrilling new alternative, a sexually charged horror fantasy with a villain more terrifying and goth than Freddy or Jason. Contains violence and gore.
I don't think Freddy or Jason ever tried to be goth.
Yeah, I think they were just, I've not watched those movies, so I actually have no opinion. I think Jason was just like sad because he got murdered, and Freddy Krueger was sad because he got murdered. I think that's the tone of those. I have no idea.
More or less.
Okay.
Freddie at least has a sense of humor about it.
Yeah, I'll get there eventually, I'm sure.
I'm sure you will.
Okay, so first thoughts and impressions for me. Oh, wow. I am obsessed with Clive Barker. That is my big takeaway. I feel like each episode so far, I have like this overarching theme. My big overarching thing is, oh, wow, I am obsessed with Clive Barker as a creator. Before I watched Hellraiser, the only thing that I had ever read of Clive Barker was the first Books of Blood. And I really liked it, but I wasn't like doing backflips or anything. But reading this book, watching these movies, and then honestly just watching interviews with him and reading like pull quotes from him, he should be super insufferable, but he's not. He's very charming because everything he says, you can feel like he has a lived experience of it, and he also genuinely believes. And I also love how he approaches stuff from a clearly like theatrical and artistic view. He is an actual artist. He has an avant-garde theater background. He's a writer, a director. He's clearly this like kind of genius, but he also never gets lofty about it. He's like, yeah, I love pop culture. Like, that's part of how we communicate, and things do get recycled. Think about, he kind of like predicted in that interview that you sent me, The Art of Horror from like 1995. He kind of predicted like the wave of remakes when he was talking about like King Kong and Dracula and stuff. And I was like, this guy is like a psychic. But I just can't wait to read more of his stuff and watch more of his stuff, because I just found him to be really charming as a creator, but also really has very good follow through in his movies. But I also like how his movies and his book are kind of ambiguous in their horrorness. Like, they're horrific, but they're neither good nor bad. They're just an exploration of like humanity and queerness and what it means to have a body. And I like all of his like ambiguity about that. So my big takeaway is fucking Clive Barker rules.
Yeah. I think of Clive Barker as part of like a cohort of writers that I otherwise know from comics.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's very much of that like Grant Morrison, Neil Gaiman, Peter Milligan generation
Totally.
of like British writers who were like really thinking about things in horror and genre that nobody else was. And of course, Barker eventually did comics too, but it's not where he broke out. But yeah, he's very much to me part of that same, especially when you start getting into like the mix of like meta and queer in like a lot of Grant Morrison's comics, I think are very similar to a lot of things going on in Clive Barker's works.
He also just has like a good sense of humor. While like this Hellraiser isn't necessarily like funny in the way that actually quite a bit of horror movies can be funny. Like there's camp elements to it, but it's not a totally funny movie, which I think is a good change of pace considering the stuff that was kind of coming out at around the same time. He is like charming and funny. One of my favorite pull quotes that I found was him just talking about how the movie got censored quite a bit, is specifically in terms of the like eroticism and the sexuality. And he just was like, God knows where the spanking footage is. Like it's out there.
Also, I love that this is this like violent horror movie with this BDSM element to it, and like the thing that the studio couldn't handle was like spanking.
Yeah, well, spanking, and they took out a sodomy scene between Julia and Frank. They were like, nope, just do regular sex. Have it be like definitely kind of rapey, but like that's fine. Take out the non-normative stuff, please. Put a knife in it. That's better. That's definitely like a huge difference, I think. Maybe not huge, but a big difference between the book, which follows like the first Hellraiser movie and Hellbound Heart, the book, are very similar. Yeah. There are some big changes. Like Kirsty in the book is just like Larry/Rory in the book. Larry's friend who has a crush on him, I guess.
Yeah, it's that relationship never makes a lot of sense. That's why I think she works better as his daughter.
Oh, she works way better as his daughter. So like that's notable. But I think the bigger notable difference in the book is how much more explicit the like S&M part of it, like the BDSM part of it, and how much more they go into the pain pleasure part of it. Like it's brought up in this movie, obviously, but I think at some point it kind of focuses more on like the pain and the horror part of it. Whereas throughout the book, I think he does a really consistent job of being like, no, it's just pleasure. I think one of the lead Cenobite in the book even says like, Frank's like, so you're going to show me pleasure? And they're like, not as you understand it. Like, yeah. Oh, we're gonna, pal, just in a different way. Also the scene in the book. So in the movie, when we first meet the Cenobites, it's really dramatic, obviously, because we get to see them and they're decked out in their pleather and all their badass piercings. And they have this incredible, at least the lead Cenobite, Pinhead, I guess, or the hell priest, depending on who you like. The lead Cenobite and then the female have a very, I'm just clocking into my 9 to 5 energy, which I really enjoy. Like they are, which leads, it's funny to think of it that way, but it also leads to their like gravitas, right? And then we have Butterball, aka the good kind boy, is what we were talking about, because he just was like vibing behind his sunglasses the whole time. Like, I'm here, I'm ready to work. And then Chatterer, I think, right? That's the teeth one. I think we were just calling him Teeth Man until I looked up their actual names. But in the movie, like we get this very impressive, their presence is there, and Frank is like, oh my God, what have I done? And you kind of see Frank almost right away being like, oh, I fucked up. Whoops. But in the book, that's my favorite chapter of the whole book, which is like the first chapter, is the ritual of it. Like Frank has to set the stage and literally build like an altar to them of like beautiful things, but also like gross bodily things, like a jar of piss, and like he has to it is like a worshipful thing, right? And in the book, when they're presented, his internal monologue of like, I'm in so much pain already, like my nerve endings are on fire, but I also have experienced this pleasure. Like in the book, he literally masturbates in front of them. Like that's his last act on earth, is like a violent orgasm in front of them. So I really liked the way that they set it up as like an uncontrollable thing in the book, but also really, really emphasize like he's having an orgasm and it's a good orgasm, but it's also like a painful orgasm. And then they're like, come, we're going to fuck with you for a while. Yeah.
Right. And we're sort of in his head in that scene too. And I love because Frank is like, at the end of the day, he like thinks of himself as a bohemian seeker of pleasure, but he's such a boring straight guy.
Yeah, totally.
And when the Cenobites show up, he's like, I thought there would be girls.
Yeah, he's literally like, his idea of pleasure is he's literally dreaming of like a harem of like virgins. Like, this is my idea of heaven. And they're like, oh, sweet summer child, come into our dungeon.
People with like body modifications and genital mutilations and pins sticking out of their head are like, oh, you have no idea.
Not as you understand it. I loved that. Yeah, the woman who designed the costumes, I think, just did, like, she knocked it out of the park. It makes sense from the description of the books. Like, they have this, like, religious kind of vibe. I looked up the word Cenobite because I was like, what is this word? It literally is a word that means a monk who lives in a religious community rather in solitude. So I love that they are always shown as, like, together. Like, we are a part of this community, which I think really speaks to the, like, queer reading of it. Like, we left our lives behind and rebuilt a community. A fun, found family in hell. Got to bring in the found family somehow. That's my bread and butter. But the costume designer, Jane Wildgoose, I think just knocks it out of the park. There was some quote I looked up that says, Barker gave her S&M magazines and piercing magazines to inspire her designs, and he wanted the Cenobites to look like magnificent super butches, which I loved.
And I love how all of their costumes have like, and the camera never really lingers on it, but they all have places where like they're like patches cut open in their costume, and then underneath there's a piece cut open in their flesh, and they're sort of like interwoven in a way where they're like folded over each other.
Yeah, like their bodies have been taken apart and then reassembled into this new ambiguous creature. Other than the one Cenobite who's literally uninspiringly called the female, which every time I take the note, I capitalize it all to just give her a little more gravitas. They are like ambiguous in their gender presentation. Like their costumes are part slaughterhouse, part leather daddy, part religious robe, part like dress, part metal, part wounds. I like the idea that they're presented more as a force together, but not as traditional, this is a family with a man and a woman and our children or whatever, or we're conforming to some kind of gender norms. Like, no, I have pins in my head and I am like the ruler of hell. Come, let's go.
And it's also worth noting that like in the movie, even though their clothing is very deliberately ambiguous, like there's like the female Cenobite and then 3 pretty obviously male Cenobites.
Yeah.
Whereas the book is like there's still 1 female Cenobite and then the other 3 we don't really know. You can't tell. They could go either way.
Yeah, well, and that the idea too of like, I think that lends itself really well to the queer reading of like, I've left the safety of, normative dress, normative thinking. I've had my body and my soul, because we're in hell, right? Literally ripped apart and reformed in a way that I think is beautiful or that I deem is pleasurable. I think especially the female Cenobite, the like piercings. I think that the female Cenobite in both movies, because they're played by different actresses, is like so gorgeous. Not even like hot or whatever. I think she's stunningly gorgeous. I love the design of the female. Even the fucking giant like neck vagina, like whatever. It works. I like it.
Well, I mean, it's convenient if you're like make out with her. Everything's like right there.
Yeah, I was in one of the articles I was reading, they referenced the comic Black Hole and how, the teenagers get a disease where they're transforming, and how there's one scene where like one of them is tonguing a wound and being like, it's just a part of you now. And it immediately made me think of the female, like, yeah, it's just another thing to tongue.
Yeah.
I liked it a lot. So all of us talk about the Cenobites. I think it's fascinating that the Cenobites are barely in this movie.
Yeah. I think that really speaks to how fascinating they are, that everybody, even people that didn't understand the like queer and S&M implications, were like immediately obsessed with the Cenobites, even though they were, because Frank and Julia are like the monsters of this movie.
Yeah.
The Cenobites are just there for a couple of scenes, but they're so cool.
Their design is fantastic. It's funny because like I didn't know anything about this movie going in other than I live in the world. So I've seen pictures of Pinhead. And so in my head, I'm like, oh, this is the big bad. He's the bad guy, right? And then I watched a movie, and he's really not. You're right. Frank is the monster, and then Julia becomes a monster with him. And the Cenobites exist in this ambiguous, like, yeah, they're torturers, but also Frank summoned them. Like, they don't just come from nowhere, and they have to be summoned each time. Like, they make a really big point about that in the book when Frank comes back. He's like, we got to get me a body and then I can actually leave this hell plane, and then the Cenobites can't follow me because they have to be summoned. So as long as we don't summon them, I'm free. And I think that comes across in the movie too, because, Kirsty has to resummon them, but they're just doing their job, frankly, I think they like their job, but they're kind of just doing their job. And I think they almost exist as like an anti-hero in these movies. They're not good and they're not bad. It's the pain and pleasure thing. They're not good. They're not bad. They bring you pleasure. They bring you pain. They completely, consistently exist in a dichotomy at all times, which is why I think they are so fascinating. And part of the reason I never want to read or watch any of the other movies, because I don't want to see them turn into like capital B bad guys. I like them being ambiguous.
The specific thing that I don't like about the later movies, by later movies, I mean starting with the third one, is that because the idea is that these are movies about hell, and that the Cenobites are essentially demons, the filmmakers get into this idea, like there aren't already enough like supernatural movies with this, that like the Cenobites are somehow interested in like punishing bad people.
Yeah.
The Cenobites don't care about punishing bad people. They just want to like experience the flesh of anyone who lets them.
Right. And they're specifically drawn to people who have like similar desires or whatever, right? Because in the second movie, Tiffany opens the box and the Cenobites are called, and Pinhead's like, you don't want this, you want this, and like points to the mirror, and the doctor's like, oh shit, my perfect plan is not working. Which I love the idea that like this girl just loves puzzles, and they were like, no, you don't want to be tortured, you just want to play puzzles. Which I think is interesting if you think about what happens in the first movie, because Kirsty doesn't mean to open it. But when they meet her in the movie and in Hellbound Heart, they're like, well, we call when we're summoned, and you technically summoned us, so I guess you have to come to hell and have fun with us. And that's when she comes with the bargain. But part of me likes that reading. I think it goes two ways, right? Like, if you watch Hellraiser 2, you're like, well, they kind of messed up the continuity when they said that thing about Tiffany, like, about the summoning. Or you can read it like, maybe Kirsty has like a darker, like, freakier desire. I really like that reading more personally.
I kind of do too. But I also think, at the very least, Kirsty wants to know what's going on. She knows that there's something supernatural happening, and she's opening the box to try and understand it, which I feel like is enough to summon the Cenobites. Totally. Tiffany doesn't even want that. She just wants to solve a puzzle because that's what she does.
Yeah, because she's been lobotomized, I think, into just loving puzzles.
Something like that.
Unclear.
I'm a big fan of Tiffany, not to get ahead of ourselves, but I love that she's this very like tropey sort of, here's this like neurodivergent child who is like really good at this one thing that we need, which in this case is opening puzzles, but doesn't like talk or anything. But then all of a sudden, when something scary happens, she just says, oh shit.
I love that that's her only, essentially her only line, especially because it harkens back to when Kirsty says it in the first movie too. And both line readings are hilarious.
Yes.
Again, these aren't particularly funny movies, but those moments are funny because they're really believable too, right? Like, sometimes when you are, as a person, confronted with something horrific or something bad happening, your body can literally shut down, right? Like, fight or flight happens, but like freeze happens too. And so if you just freeze and you see this horrific thing and then you're like, oh shit, that feels really believable to me.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, Tiffany has a little bit of like the one savior element to her, but I actually really liked her too. I have no idea how old she was supposed to be. She could be anywhere from 14 to 28, and I would be like, okay.
Yeah. The actress was like 16 or 17.
Okay.
So I guess somewhere around there, but it's hard to know. But to be a completely unknown actress who hasn't really done anything else that I've ever heard of, she's really good in a role that's almost entirely without dialogue. Like, she has really expressive eyes. She does a lot just by looking at different things and reacting to them.
Absolutely. And I think that the relationship that Kirsty and Tiffany form with like essentially a shared trauma and no words is really effective. Like,
Yeah.
Kirsty literally puts on her dead stepmother's skin and kisses a terrible Cenobite to save this girl. And then they walk away like two badasses. And I was like, I love the ending of this movie. I don't know what these two women are going to do, but they're going to tear it up. A big takeaway I have from this movie, I think I texted you this, is I have a very big crush on Ashley Lawrence. I was like, oh, I love Kirsty. And then I was like, wait, do I love her because she's like a good character, or do I just love her? I was like, both? I think it's both. I do like how she kind of pushes back on the like final girl trope. Like, she's technically a final girl, right? Because she defeats them and she's the last one surviving. But she's not like helpless at all. And she also starts off the film being like, I don't really want to live with you. I want to make my own way. I don't want to be a part of anything that you guys are doing. She is sexual. She has sex with Steve, I guess, who is just like, it's like they were like, I guess we have a young girl, so we have to bring in a guy. I love that he's both completely useless, but also like kind of helpful at the end, and then just disappears. He like accepts everything that happens, and then it's like, you know what? After I thought about it, I do never want to see you again.
Yeah, he definitely just like dopes out when she goes to the institution at the beginning of the second movie. And then, you know, she just happens to meet a doctor who kind of looks like him, I guess. So that's fine. But then he dies.
Well, I think I like that part too. And I think that works with her like final girl, not final girl stuff, because she, yes, has these relationships with other people her age or people that are like romantic, but then they're both completely useless. And when they die, she like grieves for or leaves. She barely grieves. She's like, okay, well, I'm actually busy. I have a lot to do. I have to like defeat hell or whatever, and my evil stepmother. So like, sorry, you got your brain sucked out, but like you knew what we were walking into. So maybe you should have watched your back a little bit. Like, she doesn't like care about them at all, but then again risks everything to save Tiffany, and I like that a lot.
Yeah.
You said you had some feelings about Hellraiser 2. What are your feelings about Hellraiser 2 now that you watched it twice?
Well, I mean, like I said, I really like Hellraiser 2 because it expands on the world building from the first one. Like the fact that, you know, there's this door that keeps opening in Hellraiser, and then in Hellraiser 2, like we really get to see what's behind that door.
Mm-hmm.
And the
world building of like hell and the Leviathan and things like that, I thought was really cool.
Until he becomes a Cenobite, which I'm sure we'll talk more about, I like Dr. Channard as a villain because he's just like, we had Frank, who was just like a ne'er-do-well and was also this creepy pervert. And now we have this guy who like clearly has a very successful practice and everyone respects him, and he's also a creepy pervert.
Yeah, and I like the differences, but also the sameness of Frank and the Doctor. Like, Frank was a hedonist, and he learned about the box and then was like, I got to do it. And then just like jumped in, you know, he dove into hell essentially. Whereas the Doctor has done all of this research, is literally collecting the boxes or maybe like replicas of boxes, has like portfolios of research, and he does what like a doctor would do, right? I'm going to do all of the research, and then I'll be super prepared to get into hell and control it in the way that I think it will go. And then, you know, it doesn't go quite as planned.
Yeah. But I also think it sort of moves even farther away from like the ideas of the book that are like somewhat, but not entirely in the first movie. Basically, what I'm getting at is the sex stuff.
Yeah.
Like everything becomes less messy and less sexual in the second movie.
Even though I feel like there's some more explicit stuff in the second movie, but it still feels less like the writhing in like Frank's personal hell or whatever. But it still feels like, that's not sexy. That's not what we're here for.
Yeah. And the whole idea that the realm where the Cenobites live is this sort of mostly empty stone labyrinth is just not quite as like visceral as the impression that you got of them in the first movie, let alone the book.
Yeah, especially when we first meet them in the movie and the book, where the like chains come out and we have it's like it's wet and it looks warm and uncomfortable, but also like it looks like it has a certain smell to it. It looks, you know, all of the things that can be attributed to like sex. Whereas the labyrinth is cool in the idea of like, oh, a winding, you know, whatever of hell, but it is really sterile.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, and the idea that Leviathan is this like god/devil that rules over that land doesn't even have like a fleshy body just doesn't make sense with the whole
Yeah.
thing.
He's just like a puzzle. I like the idea of like a Leviathan, a head Cenobite, like somebody who chooses who comes to hell and gets turned into a Cenobite, right? Because like Frank doesn't get turned into a Cenobite. He just is in like a hell. But certain people get chosen and they go from being a masochist to being a sadist, right? You are like chosen to become a Cenobite, to do it to other people. I like the idea of that having like a mythology and a process. But I agree with you. It's just like, other than the insides, I guess when the doctor gets turned into a Cenobite and there's like tentacles and stuff. but it should be just, it should be like a fleshy monster. I agree.
Also and this is really common, I feel like, with horror sequels where like things get simplified in the mythology, and like the fact that when Frank first comes back in Hellraiser, he's just like a wet skeleton, and then he like gradually accumulates more flesh until he's a guy with no skin. When Julia comes back, she's just a lady with no skin. Don't get me wrong, she looks amazing.
Yeah.
But she's just like has no skin, and then she gets skin, and that's like it. It's much. Oh, we do see that whole like Bluebeard room of how many people were killed off screen. So I guess they just did it all at once. But
yeah, the Bluebeard room is definitely what it is. That was like a big thing that I saw too. I love the transformation scene in the first movie. It felt, I mean, this is like a touchstone for me, obviously, because it was the second episode we did of this podcast, but it felt really like The Thing, where it was like so like wet and spidery. I don't know what it is about the 80s that loves like a human, half spider monster, and the way that it just crawled out of the floor. I thought that transformation was like stunning practical effects. And then when I was doing all of our research, learned that they didn't actually have the budget for that. And that was like a last minute thing because one of the producers or execs were like, this transformation scene is not good enough. Here's a little extra money. And so that's why that they got to have that like wet, messy transformation scene, which I read that they built like a skeleton or whatever with all the flesh or wax or whatever. And then they just slowly melted it. And then when they did it, they just did it in reverse. And I love practical filmmaking.
Oh, I completely agree.
Yeah, I like the slow. I mean, obviously the point of the second movie is not like the slowness of Julia's transformation, but I do like the slowness of Frank's transformation from a pile of like, it was just like heart and viscera in the attic in the movie. In the book, it's literally he grows back from his cum.
Right.
which
like
like you do. I really like that for two reasons. One, because again, I think it plays to that idea of like pleasure and pain and, you know, what you leave behind. But also they went into it in the book that not everybody could get their body reformed if they didn't leave anything behind. And so like his last act of onanism saved his life, actually, or could have saved his life had he not been such an idiot and a dick. But like that saved his life. And then I think that also played more into the thing in the book of like, it was a ritual to call them. And they kind of do it in the movie where he's like surrounded by candles, but it was a lot more religious when he called them to them. And I like that they brought the semen back. I really thought it was effective.
Well, there's also a thing in the book which you can imagine in the first movie. That's sort of what I like about the first movie, or one of the things I like about the first movie, is that even if it didn't include everything that's in the book, a lot of it you can sort of extrapolate once you've read the book and say, oh, well, that's still there. They're just not talking about it.
Totally.
But in the book, the idea is that Frank had to work to escape from the realm of the Cenobites, that he like found a passage back into the room that he came from. And then when he was able to like rebuild his flesh from his brother's blood and the semen and all that, like it was like a thing that took effort. And you can kind of see that in the movie, but it doesn't really, they don't discuss it. But then in the second movie, it's like, oh, well, this is, you know, the mattress that Julia died on. So we'll just have a guy put, you know, his blood all over it and she'll just come back to life. That's just how it works now.
Even though, didn't she die in the stairwell?
Well, it's it's confusing at the end of the first movie, right? Because Frank like attacks her in the stairwell and it looks like she's dead, but then Kirsty finds her a few minutes later on the
That's
bed
true.
with the box and the chains and her face ripped off.
Right. I think that implies too that maybe she found the box and was like, oh, maybe this can save me, or like goes into like a deal with the devil. Because then we also do see the female Cenobite just like prowling the halls.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's a cutscene somewhere where like Julia and the female Cenobite enter into some kind of arrangement or something together, which makes sense too in the second movie, where she's like, she's not a Cenobite, but she is an agent of hell. She's like working. She's not just like stuck there.
Right. Also, on the subject of Julia and who she was supposed to be, I feel like we've talked, and I'm sure we'll talk more about the queerness of Hellraiser, and all of the interesting implications of the book and these movies, and all of that is great. But there's a whole other dimension to it where I just have to say that, like, seeing Julia as the ultimate villain who would like go on to be like the Queen of Hell and be this like major horror villain in future installments is like the most gay male take on horror. Imagine, because she's like she's like a real housewife as satanic villain.
Yeah, she even has the like quippy like Real Housewife lines too, like, I'm no longer the wicked stepmother, I'm the evil queen. Right. Like, that is definitely a Bravo quote. Yeah, because I think the idea was that Julia was going to be the main antagonist was the main antagonist in the second film, and then had they done more, I think Clive Barker specifically wanted her to be the villain, but then the fandom or like the people who are watching it really, really gravitated more to the Cenobites. And also Julia was like, I'm going to go have like an actual acting career. Not that horror isn't like actual acting or anything, but she like went on to have like a good like stage career and stuff. I think she even won a Tony, maybe. Who knows? But yeah, that's a reading that I didn't even think of. I think that is really funny. And she has like a dress and everything too. She also has like a lot of really good fashion in the second one. I mean, that scene of her walking out with her muscles in the white suit is super sexy.
It really is.
I love the idea of her not having any skin and being like a visceral flesh monster and being presented as being sexy, especially compared to the first one where he's like, don't look at me. And like Julia is the one who like takes the step towards Frank and puts his like flesh fingers in her mouth and stuff. She's the one that's like, no, I can work with this. And then in the second movie, she's like, yeah, you can work with this.
Yeah.
I do want skin, but also like, I'm so fucking hot.
Yeah, and the shots of like Dr. Chenard's face when he's like realizing he's into it too. It's like, oh, this woman has no skin, but I think that's okay.
Well, and also like being presented with something that's like so outside the like normative view of sex. And then it's like that meme that goes around that's like, this better not awaken anything in me. Like, oops. But that's, I feel like, is a very Cenobite Hellraiser vibe. No, this better really not awaken anything in me. That's the modern day tagline. Maybe they should make that the remake's tagline. Well, I mean, we're kind of like, we've skirted around it, but I think we should just talk about how this movie, whether it was meant to be or not, is like a super queer movie. Okay, yeah. The Cenobites, and I mean, one article that we read was like, well, Clive Barker's gay, so therefore, and I was like, yeah, okay, maybe, but also that seems very reductive. But I think Clive Barker's background as somebody who was a sex worker and somebody who was really involved in like underground like gay club culture, and somebody who has even said in interviews like, on the S&M scale, I'm like a 6. Like, he's very open about his sexuality or like the way he views sex. In that YouTube video, The Art of Horror, he even has, I think I wrote it down, I'm gonna find it, because he has like this really good quote about how he views sex. He said, I find sex and ritual and mystery and the forbidden elements of sex irresistible. I love abundance and I love excess. Which I feel comes across very well in this movie.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of horror, especially these days, I could go on a whole separate rant about how horror isn't sexual enough anymore. Movies in general,
yeah,
are just gotten way less sexy since like the 80s. And when I say sexy, I don't mean like, well, I guess I kind of do, but that's not my point. Like, I'm not talking about like, oh, you should be able to like jerk off to movies. I'm talking about like, there used to be a real understanding of like sex as part of the narrative and like part of the world and how it connected with whatever kind of story you were telling. And when it comes to horror specifically, sex and horror are so connected.
Yeah.
And what is horrific and what is erotic are so connected.
I mean, even think about the scene from the movie and the book of Julia and Frank like having sex, right? From one lens, it looks horrific and looks like a rape, but from another lens, Julia's lens, thankfully, it is this like deeply erotic thing for her. But that is like a really fine line. Like horror and sex are inextricably interwoven a lot.
There's even a sentence in the book which stuck with me because my thought when reading it was like, is this okay?
I know exactly what you're going to say.
Acceptable? I'm not sure. But yeah, there's a sentence in the book that's like something like the only thing separating it from rape was her acquiescence.
Yeah, I actually I underlined it and put a post-it on it. It says, their coupling had in every regard, but the matter of her acquiescence, all the aggression and joylessness of rape. Yes.
But anyway, the point I was getting to in general is that I feel like, I don't know if it's like international marketing or like, 5 corporations running everything. I don't know what has done it, but movies in general are so much less willing to like deal with sex and sexuality now than they used to be. And I feel like that's a real detriment to horror. And part of that is just that like visceral connection. And part of it is like, I have always said, I've talked about this publicly before, I know that horror movies are better when there's nudity in them. And not for horny reasons, but for vulnerability reasons. And for like
Absolutely.
The world has gone mad reasons. Because if you always have time to grab a towel, things aren't really out of control. And I feel like even in, the days when horror and movies were more sexual than they are now, a lot of horror was kind of afraid to draw that line because of everyone's fear that it might awaken something in them. Everyone's sort of like, filmmakers tend to be sort of hesitant to put too much sex in the horror or too much horror in the sex. These movies, not afraid of that.
Yeah, I don't know if it's maybe this is like a pull and doesn't make any sense because obviously like the world is not a perfect place and there's like a lot of growth that can happen and needs to happen. But in general, this type of queerness and like specifically like BDSM stuff, but also like the fact that this was like written and directed by a gay man in the like mid 80s is there's a very different culture around being gay and being queer and being like open about it than there is now. So it almost feels like there's like an urgency to tell these stories more or like to sneak them in maybe in horror films and stuff where like obviously things need to get better nowadays, but we, have Bravo and we talk about things in a more open way. So I think sometimes people think like, oh, we did it. We don't have to do it anymore. And it's like, no, we talk about it more, but we didn't do it. We should still continue to explore these things and explore what these things mean in a more modern context, which was part of the reason I have such high hopes for the new Hellraiser that is supposed to come out this year, which we'll talk about later. But like, not only the fact that they have cast an openly trans actress, but like also what does Hellraiser look like in a 2022 atmosphere? Like, what does this original story look like in the trappings of the 2000s versus like the trappings of the 1980s? But I absolutely agree with you. There's something, I don't know a lot about horror yet, but like people continuously pick horror movies for me to watch that are in the 80s. And I think that there is a reason why people keep choosing horror movies that are in the 80s.
Yeah, very much so.
I should just call this Spooky 30s in the 1980s edition. So this is the main article that I feel this was the best article that we read. You found this article. It's not a peer-reviewed one. It's one that we found online, so easily accessible, which we'll put in our notes. But it's called Revealing the Hellbound Heart of Clive Barker's Hellraiser by Colin Erison. This was so fantastic. Like the way that he broke down not only like the Cenobites' collapse of like gender and stuff, but the idea of them sort of as being presented as like a queer community, and like Frank's still the bad guy for sure, but like Frank leaving his normativity, joining their queer community, leaving it again, but then being like summoned back to it, and that fight that he has and what they represent and the like lure of that, I thought was really fascinating. It's something that I don't think I would have, because Frank is just kind of like, again, a boring straight dude, but I like the idea of him being absorbed into the queer community.
Yeah. Yeah, again, that just the idea of like Frank who thinks of sex and naked ladies as identical, is, you know, this basically the same thing. Is like, I would have the wildest sex imaginable, so I'm going to summon the creatures that have the wildest sex imaginable, and then like self-mutilated genderqueer people show up, and he's like, wait, no ladies?
Yeah. Yeah, and even though like that's really explicit in the book, but even I think they do a good job of it in the movie. Like when Julia's going through Frank's stuff and she's finding all the photos and stuff, like they're pretty like heteronormative. Like it's just like Frank with a bunch of different hot women, and like there's no it's so shocking, and I guess shocking to Frank that like he is this like capital H hedonist that like doesn't get any joy out of anything, and he like doesn't think to like try like queer sex or like try other things other than being like real rough with ladies. And then he accidentally or like accidentally on purpose walks into a metaphysical BDSM club and is like, my eyes have been opened because they are pinned to my face now.
Yeah, basically. By the way, speaking of all the stuff that they find in Frank's debauched little bedroom, I just love what it says about the relationship of these brothers, that Larry picks up what appears to be an ivory carving of a man and woman fucking, looks at it for a second and says, oh, Frank.
Let's talk about Larry. Let's talk about Andrew Robinson. Andrew Robinson of DS9 fame.
Oh, yes.
Garrick. Andrew Robinson's such a good actor in this. His differences of like this kind of meek, I hate this phrase, but I think it will paint a picture like kind of beta male-y to Frank's like hypersexualized wearing leather jacket, alpha maleness. And then when Frank puts on Larry's skin and Andrew Robinson has to be Frank inside Larry's skin, the acting choices and the total switch is so really good. Is. Andrew Robinson does such a good job. I don't know how Kirsty didn't immediately. I mean, I guess you don't just see somebody and be like, are you a different person? Like, she's still getting used to the supernatural stuff, but he just gives off completely different vibes. You look at him and you're like, oh, that's Frank. He stole his skin. Like, we don't need to see the scene where he like rips off his skin. That's Frank.
Yeah. Or even the little like where the camera sort of pans around his head and you see like little bits of blood around his hairline. It's very unsettling. Yeah. But yeah, he immediately becomes so creepy, and you can see that like his attitude towards Kirsty in particular has become creepy and not at all fatherly anymore. And yeah, and the fact that like you sort of get why she's not picking up on it because he's literally wearing her dad's skin, but at the same time, it's like so right there.
But the moment, like you said, the moment we see him, we feel the energy from Larry towards Kirsty change. But she doesn't pick up on it. But the moment she does pick up on it, when he says, come to daddy, she's like, oh, wait a minute. You stole my dad's skin. Never mind. Yeah. I think he just did a really great job. And my heart like breaks for Larry. Larry was just trying, you know what? Like they say, the patriarchy hurts us all. And poor Larry, he didn't live up to his wife's like ideal of what a man should be. And then Frank literally stole his skin so that he could, pass in our society or whatever. But poor Larry, I feel bad for him. I am happy that in the second movie, it seems like he's not in hell.
Yeah.
He gets to go to like actual maybe heaven.
Which apparently is just because the actor didn't want to come back, but whatever.
Yeah. He was busy. He was prepping to do his most iconic character of all time. I also read somewhere that the last line that Andrew Robinson says, the like Jesus wept, that was Andrew Robinson's idea.
I heard that too.
Clive Barker wrote something simple like fuck or something, and Andrew Robinson was like, no, I think it needs to be more, it needs to be something else. And I think the not the necessarily the way that it's written, but the way that he delivers the like Jesus wept and the like smile on his face and the way that they present how he's being torn apart again. I think that really reinforces the Frank's almost acceptance back into Cenobite hell. Like, yeah, I got caught, but maybe this place isn't the worst. Maybe I should just go back here and join my Cenobite friends. And I think that leads to what the author was talking about of like, he left and now he's coming back, but he's like accepted it this time. It's not, oh no, this isn't what I wanted. I need to escape. It's like, oh, I accept my reality now.
Yeah. And there's also a kind of thing to put a sort of different spin on the book / first movie. You know, Clive Barker wasn't really out. I mean, I think he was always out in his personal life, but as far as his career as an author, he didn't come out until the 90s. And there's a real sense in the Hellbound Heart and Hellraiser that is just kind of like, just straight people are terrible. Is like a major a major theme. And, you know, that like Julia has like married this guy that she doesn't seem to be that into, but he has a really hot brother that she has had sex with before. And, you know,
on her wedding dress.
Yeah. and then you have the Cenobites, who are these very queer figures who sort of come into, you know, are invited in and are like, oh, you people are terrible. Yeah. But the Cenobites are the ones who are like, you know, judged as demons, even though the regular straight people are the ones that are just fucking each other over right and left.
Well, and also the regular straight people are the ones that transgress into the queer space, right? They're the one, like Frank literally invites himself into their space and then feels like he is
like a girl having her bachelorette party at a gay bar.
Yeah, and he goes into their space and then immediately is like, but this isn't what I think it should be. And they're like, sorry, bitch. Like, we'll show you we'll open your eyes. Again, literally, we're going to pin them to your face. Yeah, I never even thought about that. Yeah, he transgresses into their space and then says to their face, this isn't what I thought it should be. And that is a totally straight thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's the whole the thing after he, you know, has his like masturbation flashback in the first chapter, and then the female Cenobite like appears behind him and takes her robe off. And there's this real, because, you know, again, you're in his head in the scene, and there's this real sort of mixed reaction that he has. We're like, okay, this is a woman, sure, okay, yes. Oh, look, her. I think it says the extreme scarification of her pubis. Like, oh, look, her genitals are mutilated. That's fun. Oh. And there's this sort of idea there, I think, just beneath the surface of that, of him being like, well, I wanted to have sex with ladies. Oh, good. Here's a lady. Oh, no. What if I have sex with a lady and it's still not, like, safe? It's still not straight as I know it, because she's going to tear him to little pieces. Because she's literally sitting there. Pieces. She's sitting on, like, a mound of human heads. And she has their tongues like splayed on her lap.
Yeah. And yeah, I love the visual of her like standing up and all the tongues like slide away. Yeah. Oh, this is just my collection of tongues. Let me show you around my lair. I will soon be adding your flesh to my lair. In last month's episode, we were talking about this kind of foundational queer text in horror called Monsters in the Closet by Benshoff. And he talks about how, you know, monsters can represent queerness because they come into a normative space and like mess it up, right? But interestingly, Benshoff didn't really like the idea of these Hellraiser movie, or Hellraiser, the first one at least, being considered a queer movie, because he said, too often the representation of Barker's monster queers seems similar to those produced by right-wing ideologues, and I just really disagree. And that made me feel like I was reading some like 1980s anti-porn feminist bullshit. Like that made me really mad, because the idea, it almost like he fell into that thinking of, well, this is almost like too queer. So then it becomes a parody. And then that's what like the right wing thinks. And then so like it's actually not queer, but it's like it's too queer for him almost. Like, but the idea I think of the Cenobites is that not only are they representing this BDSM lifestyle or the pain and pleasure dichotomy, but they seem to me as like really anti-repression, right? Like they're hedonists. They're literally hell hedonists. They, to speak to your point about nakedness, like they choose to show part of their bodies as like naked and mutilated and have vulnerability on them. I mean, the female Cenobite has something you could grab and rip off. Like that's a vulnerability, but it's also like vulnerability and like this staunch power at the same time. And they are just flagrantly anti-repression, I think. And it's their rejection physically of like normative ideas and normative pleasure that is so in your face. And like, that's what makes it very queer to me. Like they don't even have to open their mouths or do anything. And they have disrupted the space that they're in just by existing. And I love that about the Cenobites. And that is why I will never think of them as bad people. Like they're not monsters to me. Yes, I guess they are technically monstrous, but they, like Pinhead says, angels to some, demons to others. Like that is the perfect encapsulation of what the Cenobites should be and what they represent to me, I guess.
Yeah, no, I get that. I like that.
What's the actor that played Pinhead's name?
Doug Bradley.
I'm really bad at remembering. He was a delight to learn more about. I love that all of the Cenobites, except for I think the female actresses, come from working with Clive Barker in like their weird British avant-garde theater. I love that. But I thought that you put in our document an interview with Doug Bradley, and I loved his take on Pinhead and how like when he was getting the makeup put on, it was like a meditative thing for him because it took like 6 hours or something, and how he would use that to like get in the headspace of somebody who was, oh, here it is. Here's the quote that I'm looking for. He said, so he used that time while he was getting his makeup on as like meditative and like preparing for the role. But he said, the first time I wore it being the costume, I sat in front of the mirror trying to make friends with this new face, playing some lines and seeing where they took me. Most of my decisions about playing Pinhead were made there and then. I had a sense of power, of majesty, of a kind of beauty. His threat is implied. Look what I did to myself. Now imagine what I can do to you. That is incredible.
Yes, I agree.
I love reading stuff from actors and creators, especially from movies and stuff that become so transformative or become so like these cultural touchstones, because I mean, Doug Bradley at the time didn't know that this would become this like really famous movie, and just like looking in the mirror being like, oh yeah, I get it. Like it comes across so like his performance is iconic. Like there's a reason why Pinhead is the thing that people think of when you talk about Hellraiser. Pinhead is incredible, like an incredible character. The design, the costume, but specifically the deep gravitas that Bradley brings to the character. I joke and I say it's the 9 to 5 energy, but it's not even that. It's just like I don't have to expel that much to like own a room. Yeah. Like I'm here.
I've got nails in my face. So
yeah. I think it's so interesting too that he didn't like, even in the first movie, he doesn't in the credits, like it doesn't say Pinhead.
Yeah, I think that was a nickname that like they gave him on set because of the makeup or something.
Yeah, because he's not Pinhead in the book, and then I think Clive Barker refers to him as like Hell Priest, but now he's just like Pinhead forever.
Yeah, and I remember I was thinking about this when I was thinking about my history with Hellraiser. I'm pretty sure, and in fact, I'm completely sure that I knew Pinhead from Hellraiser. Probably not, like I definitely hadn't seen it, but I knew him from being a kid in the 80s and, you know, talking to other kids about scary stuff and from having seen like Hellraiser posters at the video rental store. So I knew who Pinhead was as a kid, and I definitely knew him before I knew the like carnival sideshow definition of Pinhead, before I like knew that term from anywhere else. That was my introduction to the phrase. There was actually, now I'm just going off on a tangent, but that's probably okay.
Yeah, this is a tangent. This is a podcast built on tangents.
There was a theater in my hometown that I did like summer programs with when I was a kid, but they also did like theater aimed at adults at other times. And there was like a fancy mask / like glue on facial prosthesis of Pinhead because they had done Hellraiser as a play. And so like in the like back room of the theater, there was like this like on like a styrofoam head, there was like Pinhead. And I remember being really creepy when I was a kid.
It's like their own version of the Pinhead face on the Torment rack. I love that. I wonder, I bet you this would work really well. Like, really, if you had the right stage direction, like an intimate space, being in the same space as like a Hellraiser play could be really interesting, especially because Clive Barker has a theatrical background. I could see, you can kind of see it because this is one of his earlier works. I think you can kind of see the like capital T theatricality of it.
Well, like it's not all set in that one house, but it could be. It's like all about that
very
one
easily.
house.
I think the idea that Doug Bradley says when he said like, look at what I did to myself, imagine what I could do to you, is a really interesting way to view the first movie, but then also leads into the second movie and how like Dr. Channard gets turned into a Cenobite. We see at the beginning of Hellraiser 2 that Pinhead was just like a dude and he called the Cenobites through the box, was a shitty colonial, I think.
It's supposed to have been in World War One.
Okay. Still, not great. But I like the idea of entering into that space, literally getting torn apart, being a supreme hell masochist, like a masochistic monster, and then having that transform you into a sadist. I think that is a really interesting journey, I guess, for the Cenobites, but also for like characters like Julia, right? Like Julia starts as like, I love Frank, so I'm gonna get him those bodies. But then with each body she brings, we were joking, like each body she brings, her mullet gets a lot more intense. And like, that's how you know she's becoming a bad guy. But like with each awful thing that she does, she starts to slowly accept that she's becoming like evil and she's actually a part of it. And then in the second movie, after Frank's betrayal, she doesn't give a fuck about Frank anymore. She's like, no, whatever. I will be the villain now, or I will be the evil stepmom. And I think that that's interesting for Julia's journey, but the mythos of the Cenobites of like, you have to go through this extreme masochistic ordeal, but then on the other side, you could eventually become the sadist and be a part of the Cenobite organization. I really like that. And even in the line, there's a line where Kirsty in the book is about to go fuck up Frank. And she was like, Kirsty in the book is really meek.
Yeah.
Kirsty in the movie is kind of badass. Like right from the get, she's like, I don't need to be at home. I got a job. Like whatever. I love you, Dad. But like, I hate your wife. But in the book, she's really meek because she like loves Rory, who is Larry, like loves Larry, but respects that he married Julia. And she can't even tell a funny joke at dinner. Like she sucks in the book. But she has this line where she goes back to fuck up Frank and says she would find the thing that had torn her and tormented her and make him feel the powerlessness that she had suffered. She would watch him squirm. More, she would enjoy it. Pain has made a sadist of her. I was like, yeah, girl. I read that book.
I find Julia, I think, a little more interesting in the book because Julia in the movie, part of this might be casting. I mean, I think, what is her name that plays Julia in the movie? She's very good.
Claire Higgins.
Yeah, she's very good, but she both looks and seems like a wicked queen from the first time you see her. The impression that you get of Julia in the book is that she's just like the most beautiful woman you've ever seen. And then the fact that she's sort of cold and troubling is sort of a surprise because she's so beautiful. And I think that's sort of like, I don't know, there's something lurking beneath the surface of Julia in the book that I feel like is already on the surface when we first see her in the movie.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And in the book, we see Rory and Kirsty like make excuses for Julia too. Like, oh, well, Julia's never had the same problems as I, Kirsty, this like meek little woman have had. Or like Rory being like, well, Julia's like kind of a shitty wife because she like clearly doesn't love him, but she's so beautiful and I still love her. So I will acquiesce to being treated shittily as a husband.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting too. One of the articles that I read was called Monster Pains, Masochism, Menstruation, and Identification in the Horror Films by Aviva Briefel. And this actually doesn't talk about Hellraiser that much, but the idea behind it is that male monsters in films are like the masochistic ones. They're the ones that like will harm themselves as like a threat to their victims, like Freddy Krueger, like chopping his fingers off and being like, but I'm going to do it to you. That idea that Doug Bradley was talking about, like, look what I do to myself. Imagine what I'm going to do to you. And then in this article, they present that like when the female monster engages in masochistic acts, she does it either by coercion from an outside force or like as a way of terminating her monstrosity. So like in Alien 3, I think, when she becomes infected, Ripley like kills herself or whatever. But I like that reading this article and then thinking about Hellraiser, because Julia is kind of both. Like, yeah, Julia is being coerced by Frank because she like loves him, and Julia believes that he loves her and that they're in this like folie à deux, but he's actually just like using her. She's like, we're in this madness together, and he's like, psych, LOL. Sorry, I missed. I stabbed you. I'm gonna go try and fuck my niece, I guess. I don't know. So like she is being coerced by him, but in the book and the movie, I agree with you that it comes across in the book more because with each kill, she becomes kind of more herself and becomes more like, oh, I was actually evil this all along. But in this article too, they argue that women be menstruating, like, right? And in horror films, like that menstruation or like coming of age puberty is used a lot, right? Like Carrie or Ginger Snaps. But I think it's really interesting in this movie specifically, Julia like never bleeds until the end. She's literally spilling all of this other, like she's bringing blood and she's a blood handler, but she is spilling male blood. And Frank even says like every drop of blood you spill puts more flesh on my bones. And in the book, there's a line where Julia is like thinking about Frank and she says, I made this man. Yeah. Like I brought this blood and I made this man. And so she is engaging in like evil acts, but it's not actually really by coercion. She like at the end, she's like, no, I like that I have power over this man that who supposedly loves me. Like and then in the second movie, she's the one that's in charge. Yeah. Like I love that journey for Julia.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I don't know. I just love the idea of her killing all these dudes. Dudes who really deserve it too. In the movie, they do a really good job of making them like shitty.
Yeah, that first, or I guess only bar that she goes to is the most horrific 80s place ever. It's just like way too well lit and looks like something out of a like...
It looks like an airport bar or like a hotel lobby.
Yeah, something very much like that. And like the worst version of that. But you know, if you don't care what guy you pick up, it's never that hard to pick up a guy. Yeah. If literally all you need is that he has blood, you're probably going to succeed.
Yeah, and she picks up... Well, the first dude is kind of like an asshole and it's like, oh, you're not going to... You know, he gets kind of like forceful with her, but she also picks up dudes who feel like they're owed something. I think that comes across in the movie at least. And so it doesn't feel bad when she kills them.
No, I don't feel bad for any of those guys.
I don't feel bad for a single one of them. So what do you think about Frank and Julia's relationship? Like if we're talking about, we see her journey of being kind of like a tool and then being somebody who is in control more or less. I think their relationship is interesting because originally you pitched this and I was like, we'll save it for February. It's a love story, and you're like, not really.
Yeah, I mean, the only characters that walk off into the sunset at the end are Kirsty and Tiffany, and I feel like Tiffany's a little too young for her.
Yeah. I don't get a vibe from them. I get like we're gonna be like a sisterly vibe, and we're gonna like fuck it all up. Do either of them come back in the later movies?
Kirsty comes back briefly in one of the later movies, which I have not seen. I don't think Tiffany ever appears again. There in the comics that Clive Barker wrote that extend the world of the movies, Kirsty eventually becomes like, I don't want to say a Cenobite hunter exactly, but she like tracks down puzzle boxes and tries to stop people from summoning the Cenobites, and then eventually she actually becomes a Cenobite herself.
Oh, I love that.
But what goes on in the comics is a lot more interesting and in line with the first movie than anything that happens in the later movies.
Does she fight the bone dragon?
I don't know that we ever see the bone dragon again. There's a lot of stuff in that first movie that's sort of like, I guess they just did that.
Yeah. I think I was even in one of the things I was watching, there was like an interview with Bob Keane who was like, yeah, Clive was just like, but what if there was a dragon made of bones? Wouldn't that be cool? And Bob Keane was like, yeah, I guess I'll make it happen for you, man.
I'll say this, as far as monsters go, I will take the bone dragon over the version of the engineer that's in the first movie. The like upside down monster that just chases Kirsty through hallways.
With like weird, like blinking eyes,
Yeah.
like a Chuck E. Cheese robot eyes.
Right.
So I love the design of all of the Cenobites, except for maybe the engineer, though I don't even know if he counts as a Cenobite. The dragon was cool. I did like the idea of every time a puzzle box is like closed or or discarded, like the guardian comes back and takes it and starts the cycle all over. I like the cyclical nature of it, like that there will always be some kind of hedonist looking for a way into the Order of the Gash. So I like all the design of the Cenobites in the first movie. And then obviously those ones come back. I love me some Butterball, good time guy. I hated the design of the Dr. Chenard's Cenobite. I hated everything about that.
It's just like too much.
It's too much. He's a different like color skin. It's more like purpley and stuff. He's got the wires, which I kind of like that the idea of the cutting that's a la Pinhead, but Pinhead's is like regimented and controlled, and his is just like, bleh.
Yeah.
I got some piano wire on my face.
And and there's like a big dick coming off of his head that like carries him around. And then some like smaller dicks that come out of his hands that have different attachments. It's all just too much. Also, he keeps doing like doctor puns, like he's like, which is very like Freddy Krueger, like Pinhead never makes jokes. That's part of what's cool about Pinhead. So the fact that the doctor just immediately is just full of doctor one-liners when he attacks people, it's just like, no, this is terrible.
It sort of works in that the doctor sucks and like could actually never be a part of the Order of the Gash, right? Like you wish you could be a part of our cool club, but you actually are an interloper. But you're right. The like design of like the giant dick with even the cast and crew in an interview that I watched, they were like, yeah, it's a dick. What do you want? Like we made a giant dick. We did that. There's nothing I can say about it. It's a dick. Okay. It's a dick. So is the implication that, because this is confusing to me, that the doctor becomes a Cenobite, but he doesn't become an Order of the Gash. He becomes like that dick is like Leviathan's arm. And so the Leviathan is controlling him. So he's like half.
I was never completely clear on that. Whether or not that was Leviathan's dick or just a general Hell Sky dick. I don't know how many there are.
Well, because like, why would the doctor be more powerful than like the Order, like 4 members of the Order of the Gash, unless he had...
Yeah, I agree that does make sense. I don't know. There's a lot about the ending of Hellraiser 2 that I do not understand. I like when they turn back into their human forms, though, when they die, the Cenobites. Yeah.
I like that they're no longer alive, so they're no longer like actively participating in their otherness, and they're completely... It's like they get kicked out of hell.
Yeah.
It's like, you can't be here anymore, so you have to go be normal. And that's like actually their version of hell is becoming normal again, right? Like if they die, they can't go to hell because hell is a dreamscape to them. So if they die, they actually just kicked off back to Earth in their boring like bodies. I don't think they actually get kicked back to Earth, but I'm just saying they get like their boring bodies is like their hell.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That's how I read it, at least. Yeah, Hellraiser 2 is a fun watch for many reasons, but I don't think it's great. Yeah, there's too much going on with that Cenobite. Though I do like, it is metal as hell that Kirsty puts on her dead mom's skin.
Yeah, that's pretty
to
great.
Save Tiffany. She is the most, I mean, admittedly, I don't have a lot of experience with Final Girls because I'm like not watching. I haven't watched a lot of that type of horror yet, but I've read a bunch of them. And obviously it's a thing that is thrown around when you talk about pop culture, but she just seems so capable and so badass. Like she doubts herself, but not even really. Like she gets put into basically a insane asylum, and she immediately is like, yeah, no, I believe what I saw. Like you can believe me or not, but like I have a duty. I have to go like make sure Julia doesn't come back. I got stuff to do. Like you can call me crazy or you can come along. And that like milquetoast doctor is like, I guess I'll come. Yeah. And then he fucking dies. But like I love that she's just immediately like, I got it. Like it's going to be hard, but I have literally run through hell barefoot, which was questionable, but I walked out with like no staph infections. So I think I'm good. There's a lot of my notes. Like, why are you in hell with no shoes on? Put some shoes on.
There are no shoes in hell. You just have to walk through that shit.
No shoes in hell. That's the real hell. No shoes in hell. You have to walk through this terrible carnival. Literally a carnival. A random scene. Like, we got to put clowns in somewhere.
It's
people
not
are
hell
terrified
if
of
there's
clowns.
no clowns.
It's not hell if there's no clowns. So before we move on to some listener thoughts and questions and a very special thing that Elle is going to do, before we close out, we have these two elemental questions that we've kind of started to talk about in this podcast. So the first one is the horror of this movie on top of the plot, or is the plot dependent on the horror?
The plot is dependent on the horror.
Yeah, this one is literally like you are walking into hell for body horror. The second question is, do the horror elements add or subtract to the story? I have like a wild answer to this, but I want to hear yours.
I mean, I want to say add, but I don't know what the story is without the horror elements.
Yeah, I think that the horror elements are the story, but I also think if you try and break down the story of this movie and book, there actually kind of isn't a plot. Like there is a plot, but it's like it's kind of like a really loosey-goosey movie and book where like nothing happens, but everything happens. But it's not, I don't think it follows a lot of traditional like film structure, which I think really adds more, even kind of more than the horror element. I think it adds to the like frenetic nature of the horror in this movie is the fact that it's kind of like all over the place because nobody can kind of get a grasp on anything. But yeah, this movie is very much just like, look at all of these horrible things in hell. / maybe super pleasurable things in hell. You'll have to come join the Order of the Gash.
Speaking of
the best name.
bringing together like the horror and the sexual, like Order of the Gash just says it all.
Yeah. When I read that in the book, I was like, oh, okay. So the book is just like not pulling any punches. The Order of the Gash. Got it. 100%. So as always, we have some like listener thoughts and questions or like in our Discord. If you want to join our Discord, and you can do it through our Patreon at patreon.com/NYD Productions. And some of the takes on this were very funny. Our friend Rosemary, who was on the podcast last month, the horror elements that we were talking about earlier didn't really get her. It was all the bugs. Like when Larry walked into the kitchen and the food was decaying, all the maggots. Yeah, all the bugs, which is great. I like that there's different elements of horror in this movie. Like not only do we get like that type of horror, we get the BDSM horror that we talked about, but we also get like, it is also kind of like a gothic story. Like it takes place in like a giant British house. Yeah. Like it has that like gothic, like they literally do almost everything in the attic, like the spooky attic. I really like that part of it. Our friend Helena, who is going to be actually on the podcast later, she talked about how Barker's idea of hell really impacted her and the way that iconography informed her as like a performer and an actor. She said it has this macabre blend of sci-fi, grotesque horror, and fantasy elements, which are all the things I love in horror, especially of that decade. And I think that speaks a lot, again, to why people keep picking things from the 80s. That like visceralness is something that just like imprints on your mind. Like, I don't want to watch any modern day horror movies. And as always, we have a peg, marry, kill from our good friend Jolene. So this is a question for both of us. If you had to peg, marry, or kill Pinhead, Butterball, or the Chatterer?
Oh, okay. You want me to answer first? I think I have it.
Yeah, you got it. Go.
Okay. I'm afraid this will be controversial, but I'm going to say that I'm going to kill Butterball. And that's nothing to do with
good time guy.
Nothing to do with body shaming or anything like that. Just that he always seems more invested in like his own vibe than like doing anything with anyone else.
Yeah, he seems like he would be kind of a selfish lover.
I mean, he literally has like his eyes and ears sewn shut. Like he's not interested in outside stimulation. On the other hand, Chatterer doesn't have eyes or ears, but he will put his fingers in your mouth.
That's true. That scene, I like screamed. That was like the only part of the first movie where I made an audible noise is where Chatterer just shoves his hand in Kirsty's mouth. Wow.
Yeah, like there aren't a lot of horror movies where you see like a full-on mandible claw.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'm going with Peg, Chatterer, and marry Pinhead.
Yeah, it would be hard not to marry Pinhead. Yeah. So then you would have to be like a priest's wife. You'd have to be a pastor's wife.
But a hell priest.
And all of the duties. Yeah, but you got to make the hell cookies for the gathering. You got to make sure everybody's tithing and you have to put on a good face the whole time. You have to make sure that your metal accoutrements are always shining. There's a lot of pressure being a hell priest wife.
Yeah, but I think I'm up to it if I'm honest.
Yeah. It does sort of seem like a dream job.
Like, yeah, you have to put
Yeah,
on
I
a
would
good
marry-
face, but like there's so many people's faces you can choose from.
Yeah, you could have like the Return to Oz closet.
The Hall of Heads.
Different. Yeah. I'm shipping that now. Pinhead and the witch. I would marry Pinhead, and I think I would kill Chatterer because the teeth are a lot. And I would peg Butterball. Like, he doesn't have to participate. I can
That's
do all the
fair.
work. And so we talked a little bit about our excitement for, or at least my excitement for the remake with Jamie Clayton that's supposed to come out this year. How do you feel about the remake?
I'm excited to see it. I'm pro remake in general. I'm
Yeah.
not one of those people who hates remakes. Like, I absolutely love the Suspiria remake, and I love the Rabid remake. So I'm up for that. I really like the casting of Jamie Clayton as Pinhead. I think that's really interesting. Especially because the like Pinhead figure in the book is a much more androgynous / feminine figure than Doug Bradley ever was. So I think that's very interesting. I'm a little worried about the sex thing because, as I was talking about earlier, movies just don't seem as engaged with sexuality. And if they try to make Hellraiser even less sexual than the 1987 movie is, I just don't know that there's a movie there that will work.
Yeah. I'm hoping because Clive Barker is like directly involved in this one that will play into that. And also because it's not coming out in movie theaters. It's like coming out, I think, strictly on a platform. So hopefully they get a lot more wiggle room.
Yeah, I hope so.
in their sexuality. I hope so too. But I'm also personally a little worried about watching it because I love these movies. They are really visceral, but they are visceral in like a 1980s way, which is like, okay, I can see the like strings and stuff. And like, that makes me, I like talking about the practical effects and they're really icky, but like, I can tell that it doesn't look real. I'm a little worried about what a very hyper realistic Hellraiser is going to do to my psychosis.
Well, that's fair. That's fair.
Personally, but I'm going to watch it. So they're doing a remake with Jamie Clayton. That's all new cast. And you're the best fan caster on the internet. So do you got a fan cast for us, Al?
I do. I tend to think about this anyway. That's how I no longer professionally fan cast, but I did for like a good 5 or 6 years. And I got that job initially because I just did it all the time as a hobby. So yes, I have thought about a fan cast for Hellraiser. Now this isn't related to the Jamie Clayton production. Although I have respect for her and I'm interested to see that. I just sort of started from scratch. And also, I didn't write any of this down. This is all in my head. So it may take me time to remember a few names. But
oh, that's fine.
My pick for Kirsty, and I am going with the daughter rather than the mousy friend who's in love with him, because
yes,
that was just like the fact that Barker did both the book and the movie himself kind of says to me that he realized that it worked better if she was just his daughter.
Yeah, especially since Hellbound Heart was published in 1986 and Hellraiser was made in 1987. Like, there's not a lot of room. It's like almost like he immediately published it and was like, actually, it should have been a daughter. Fuck. Oh, I can redo it.
Right, yes. My pick for the Kirsty role is Liv Hewson.
I'm going to have to look up all
they're
these people.
a young non-binary actor, but they present pretty like queer femme, and they tend to play a lot of like queer female roles. They were the daughter on Santa Clarita Diet.
Oh, they're on Yellow Jackets too.
Say they're on Yellow Jackets.
I love that casting.
I specifically, in doing this casting, I want to make Kirsty queer because I feel like we can embrace the queerness of Hellraiser to begin with, but now it's like 2022. We don't need straight heroes.
Yeah. We don't need straight heroes.
Yeah. And with that in mind, I think I would replace, I'm also kind of going pretty British with it, and not necessarily Kirsty and her dad and uncle, but as far as like everyone else, like I do like the idea that it's in London, even though they sort of avoided that in the first movie. In the final cut.
Yeah, that's something we didn't talk about. Like, originally was set in England. It literally in one of my notes is I was like, why are there so many British people in this? But then one of the studio execs was like, make it more American. So they like dubbed over several people's lines, including Frank's lines, to be more American, which is stupid.
Yeah, and it does kind of contribute to like a dreamlike feeling of the whole thing, because it doesn't seem like any real place. Just they're like vaguely in a city where it rains a lot.
Where it rains a lot, but there is like an abandoned lot with a bunch of fire
Right,
pits
yes.
just going at all times in case you gotta burn some hell memorabilia.
But in keeping with the British setting and making Kirsty queer, I want to replace, I don't remember his name, the useless boyfriend character.
Steve.
Yes. I want to replace Steve with Patricia Allison, who plays Ola on Sex Education.
Oh, I love this. I'm furiously Googling everybody.
And for Frank, and I know in the book, Frank is supposed to be this like big burly guy with a mustache, but I'm sticking more with the visual of the movie Frank, but I want to make him Robert Pattinson.
I love this casting.
and I want to make Frank a little queerer too. Like, there's no reason that he has limited his experimentation and seeking of pleasure to just fucking lots of ladies. That's silly.
Yeah. I love the idea of Robert Pattinson because, like, as a Twilight movie fan, the whole idea of Edward is that he's like this very like intense whatever, but he actually does really love Bella. But like, what is Robert Pattinson like as a psychopath without that love? And I think that he could be a really good Frank, especially because Robert Pattinson, even just kind of as a person, just always like drips disdain.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's absolutely fantastic casting.
And my idea for who should play Larry / Rory actually came from asking myself the question, who would be Robert Pattinson's ineffectual, less sexy older brother? Which is how I landed on Adam Scott.
Oh man, that is very good.
And I also think he's talented enough to also be Frank and Larry's skin when it comes to that. And then for Julia, I wanted, like I was saying, I wanted someone who's a little less evil queen than Claire Higgins is and just more beautiful, but who can still definitely play evil. So I think Natalie Dormer as Julia would be really great. And then for the Cenobites, I didn't like cast one-to-one Cenobites because if we're like readapting the book, it's all kind of vague. And I just sort of wanted a like collection of people who could be Cenobites. But my number one choice for the head Cenobite / Hellraiser figure would be V. Nixie. That's letter V, last name Nixie, since I know you're Googling as I talk.
I am.
She is a mostly like movement performer and like suit actress who does like, she does like a lot of the like zombies and monsters on like American Horror Story and stuff like that. She's very interesting looking and also very good at like playing in heavy makeup. Even
when she's standing still, you can like feel movement in her body.
I also think Tristan Risk would make a great Cenobite. Have you seen American Mary? American Mary is like a horror movie set in the world of extreme body modification. So not completely unrelated to Hellraiser. And Tristan Risk in heavy makeup plays a character who has had herself surgically altered to look like Betty Boop.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, I like her a lot, too. And obviously, you know, if you can get Doug Jones in there to do some weird shit, get Doug Jones. Why would you not?
Oh, 100%. Every time I read Doug Bradley, even though I know that Doug Bradley and Doug Jones are different people, my first thought would be like, Doug Jones is like, no, different Doug who's good at like spooky makeup and movement.
Yeah, the other spooky bald Doug.
Yes.
Also, Lachlan Watson is another genderqueer actor that I think could do some interesting things in a Cenobite type of role.
Oh, yeah.
And then...
Oh, yeah, they're in Chilling Adventures of Sabrina,
yes.
Right?
Yeah, they play the trans character whose names escape me. And then as far as the second movie, I didn't put as much thought into it, but I think Thomasin McKenzie would make a very good Tiffany.
Yeah.
And I want... Richard Brake is my favorite character actor, and I want to put him in everything, so I'm just making Richard Brake Chenard.
I had to Google that one, but he's one of those people that you see his face and you're like, oh yeah, that guy.
He's got one of the all-time great faces.
He would be such a good evil doctor with like a giant dick on his head.
I think maybe we don't do the giant dick this time.
Oh, okay. You want to cut the giant dick?
I think, you know, if we're refreshing these movies for modern sensibilities, like we could have a giant dick, just not necessarily the one like plunging into Dr. Chenard's head.
And we want like a wet and messy Leviathan.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Fleshy. want a flesh mound. But just like a maw that makes indescribable noises. That's all I want. Leviathan.
This is something I should have brought up earlier because I know we're supposed to be winding down now, but I'm thinking about it, and this is something I've been like, should I talk? How directly should I talk about these things? I don't know. But can I just talk about like self-mutilation and its relationship to sex and gender for a minute?
Yeah, I think that is very on brand for this topic.
Yeah, so I was talking about like the things, the ways that Hellraiser brings sex and horror together in ways that other properties are sort of afraid to do. And I feel like something that Clive Barker understands that lots of people making horror sort of interact with without really understanding is that self-mutilation is hot. And, and we can talk about that in lots of different ways because there's like, there's like body modification, there's like various kinds of like piercing, tattooing, scarification, there's cosmetic surgery of various kinds, and then there you get into like gender. And I come from the perspective of, being trans and non-binary and I transitioned at an earlier age and then sort of retransitioned into a more neutral place. So I just want to make clear to the listeners, like people who don't know me, that that's where I'm coming from when I say the things I'm about to say. I'm not saying this as like a cis person. Trans people are constantly accused of, quote unquote, mutilating themselves by transphobic people. And, and that sucks. And trans people should be free to express themselves in all ways, including surgery, however they feel comfortable. But at the same time, it's kind of true. Like self-mutilation is sort of an element of what, is sometimes part of the trans experience. And I think that makes things like the Cenobites and the idea of like the Order of the Gash and people like cutting each other up or tearing each other apart for, among other things, sexual pleasure. I think it's all very tied in together. And I think that makes it, I mean, I can't speak for other people. And I certainly can't speak for cis people, but I know for me as a non-binary trans person, that makes it sexy in a way that like this, that there's that whole idea of, okay, is this too weird a thing to say on a podcast? I'm not sure, but I'm going to say it because this is your podcast, not my podcast. I think there's a way in which like castration or like genital mutilation is like kind of the hottest thing, but it's like the thing you can only do once.
Yes.
But then maybe if you're in hell, that's not necessarily true.
Well, and also it's the hottest thing if you are the one that has like agency over like that choice, right?
Obviously.
Because you're saying like, this is the body that I want. I think it goes back to the female Cenobite, how like you were talking about Frank is like, oh, it's a woman. Oh, it's not a woman how I perceive it. And the female's like, no, this is exactly what I want my genitals to look like. I think that makes, I don't think that's an outrageous thing to say on this podcast.
If nothing else, this is the podcast to say that on.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I like the idea too that you present of hell in the Cenobites of like, yeah, this is how I made my body look right now, especially the Cenobites who are like more in charge, right? Like I want my body to look like this now, but I could regenerate theoretically and go through a different type of like transformation because it's hell, it's magical. Who cares?
And there was this conversation going on with the casting of Pinhead. Of course, there's a bunch of dumbasses who object to trans people ever doing anything. So they were like mad that they had cast a trans woman as Pinhead. And the stupidest thing that I saw just in general was some tweet about how it was, I can't even remember the word that they used, that they made it sound like it was some sort of travesty to, as they put it, erase Pinhead's service in World War I. And on one hand, that's completely fucking ridiculous. Like, don't get me wrong. I like that Pinhead served in World War I because there's that whole like lost generation thing. And when you see him as a World War I soldier in the second movie, you can sort of immediately understand that he saw the worst things people had ever done to each other. And then he became disenchanted and decided to, go off and like unlock the sex box. But it doesn't really matter. But the final iteration of that thought is, we don't know that just because Jamie Clayton is playing Pinhead, we don't know that Pinhead wasn't an officer in World War One. We don't know what Pinhead's gender was as a human. If Jamie Clayton is trans, there's no reason. Like, Pinhead could have been anything before like the cutting started. There's like,
right. That's the point.
So and I don't know if they'll go that direction at all, but like, I think Pinhead's name in the old continuity is Elliot Spencer. That could still be Pinhead's dead name in the new version. There's no reason for it not to be. Pinhead as a human could have been anything, just like Chatterer was a little boy somehow.
I forgot all about that. Yeah, because I think that bringing up like Chatterer as a little boy, like his body went through such intense transformation. Like there's no way, even if you cut the little boy's skin, like he would never make up that much mass, right? So there must be some kind of like magical element involved. Also, Elliot is like a pretty gender neutral name too, so who knows? I'm hoping that I don't know if they'll take it as far as you've presented, but I hope that they don't just use Jamie Clayton as like a look, we cast Pinhead as trans. Isn't that like interesting? Because like Cenobites could be very like genderqueer. Like I hope they do take it more past that to like kind of the level that you're talking about of being like, let's talk kind of about how the Cenobites are created and stuff.
Yeah, I would be interested to see that. That's kind of what I would like to see from that movie, is just like, I would like to see it do things that the original movie wasn't prepared to do.
Yeah. Especially if you're going to remake something, like, again, I'm not against remakes either. Like a good remake is great, but if you're going to remake something like this, like, you got to push it to a different level. Like you don't need to redo it. You have to remake it.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you threw that in at the end. I think that's a perfect way to wrap up. So as we wrap up, thank you so much for being on this podcast. And thank you for picking this property. I really, really, I think I texted you and I was like, I'm having like pre-nightmares. I'm like really nervous to watch this and I don't know why. So I don't know if I would have sought this out on my own. I don't know why. It just seems very spooky in a way that I wasn't used to. But then I watched it and I was like, oh, this fucking rules. This is the best. So thank you for picking this.
I was at first a little worried about the body horror stuff, particularly the like Frank coming back scenes, because I know you've talked about body horror before. But then once I listened to you talk about John Carpenter's The Thing, I was like, okay, it'll be fine.
Yeah, if you can handle The Thing, you can handle this. Yeah, the thing that I am learning is when I said body horror before, it's not this type of body horror. It is more, I think it more falls into like torture porny stuff. Like I don't think I could handle Saw. I don't know. Maybe someday I will try it. But I think like grossness and viscera and stuff is something that I'm okay with. And I think like I love werewolves and shit. Like you can't love werewolves without loving gross transformation scenes, right? And I think a thing that I'm really learning is that I love 80s viscera. Specifically, the wetness of 80s horror films is something that I'm very into.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So where can people find you on the internet if they want to follow you? And they should.
Well, you can find me on Twitter or Instagram at Another L. My podcast, what is my podcast called? Sword and Podcast. Podcast that I started last year that unintentionally went on hiatus for a while is coming back. There may be an episode. Let's see. There won't be an episode out by the time this comes out, but there will be one out soon. So I'm back on track with that. So you can check that out. I also wanted to mention, because this actually relates to this episode, some voice acting work that I recently did.
Oh, exciting.
My friend Andrew Isla, who would make a great guest for this podcast, by the way, but they do a web series called Obsidian National Park, which is a combination of like puppetry and animation. It's sort of a creepy comedy about animals, mostly owls, that live in this creepy park. Anyway, Andrew asked me late last year if I wanted to be a guest voice on an episode. And the episode, which is the next episode that's going to come out, I'm not sure the exact release date, but it shouldn't be too long, is a riff on Hellraiser.
Exciting. First of all, the whole thing sounds cool already. I'm sold, but now I'm absolutely sold. That sounds so cool.
And I'm playing two parts. I'm playing the sort of keeper of the box character. Nice. And I'm also playing the Pinhead character.
I'm so excited for this.
Yeah. So that's Obsidian National Park. You can go ahead and find that and subscribe on YouTube. And that episode will be out soon. And obviously, I will definitely share it widely when it is. But I pretty much share all of their episodes because it's a lot of fun.
It sounds like a lot of fun. And also, just like a double plug for your podcast, if you want to listen to my voice some more, I'm on an episode of Elle's podcast talking about Clash of the Titans. Well, thank you again for being on this, and I will see you all over the internet.
Yes, I'm sure.
Oh, Kersley. We thought we'd lost you.
So sweet of you to come back.
How can it send us back, child? We're already here. And so are you.
Now it's time for Nightmare Corner with producer Bobby Hoffman. You ready for this dream?
Yeah, I am. You had it really... So we should talk about... You had it really early on, like right after you watched it, right?
Yeah.
Because usually shit needs to bake in your brain for a little bit.
It didn't. Actually, with this one, I had... like, not pre-nightmares, but I had like a lot of anticipation for this one. I don't know why, but I was really nervous to watch these because I had only ever seen like the normal clips like Pinhead or whatever, and I really built it up in my brain. That's a running theme in like my horror exploration. A lot of things that I thought were super, super scary, and I really built it up in my head. Once I watch it, I'm like, oh, it's not as... My head's the nightmare. It's the real hell's this brain. So I was really anticipating it. And then I watched Hellraiser 1 and 2 back to back. And they're spooky, but they weren't nearly as terrifying as I thought. But I think I was percolating for so long. And then I watched 2 of them. And
there was a lot of information around it in your head.
Yeah. I was having feelings about another thing that will come up in the dream. And so it was just like a lot of big feelings that mushed into truly. And I woke up and was like, oh, okay. So you ready?
Yes, I am. I am ready. My body is ready for such delights and horrors.
Oh boy, my subconscious was doing the most. Okay, for context, it's like 5:45 in the morning, the day after. Oh, sorry. Authenticity. The day after I watched Hellraiser 1 and 2, which also happens to be a night that I watched WWE NXT. Okay, buckle up for this one. So, as people know, probably, I work for a wrestling website, and the way that I know Elle is that they also used to work for a wrestling website, but they write about wrestling and used to have a wrestling podcast, and Twitter can be magical. It's not just a cesspool, and that's how we became friends, right? So me and Elle both have a wrestling critique background, I guess. So oh, my cat just fell or something. I don't know. It's really early. So me and Elle are in the audience of NXT. And this is NXT 2.0. It's happening in a pool. I guess. I don't know. Okay, so they've decided to do a Hellraiser gimmick. And me and Elle are like dubious already, right? Because we're like, there's no way they're gonna pull it off. Well, spoiler, we were right. So all of the Cenobites are like cutting a promo, and they're cutting a promo for the first time. So they pop out of the water one by one. Oh man, I'm not gonna remember all of them. The first one that pops out is a female wrestler. I can't identify any of the wrestlers, by the way, so they're just like random wrestlers. A female wrestler dressed in all black, but more like a Toxic Attraction style gear than Dami Cenobite gear. And it just has like a giant fake nose that's like a balloon, but is huge, right? It's like a wide elephant trunk, and it's a bright blue fake nose that like covers her mouth too, and it's got like bumps on it. But other than that, she's got like beautiful hair and like makeup or whatever, and she's like wagging around her big weird nose. And then there are 2 Cenobites that are just like dumb WWE hot girls, and they're supposed to be like Dami, I guess. I don't know. they're not. And then I think the Pinhead character was just like a really tall girl in like dom clothes and had some like, it kind of looked like the female with just like random wires and stuff, but like not spooky, just more like sexy, like the most sexy. So it's just like kind of three normal looking people. This girl with like a weird nose. Okay, so they're cutting this promo and me and Elle are pissed. We're like in the pool at this point. We're pissed and like loudly, especially me. Elle's kind of keeping it together, but I've like lost it because like I'm a new Hellraiser fan, right? And I kind of like protect the protect the gimmick or whatever. I'm loudly just complaining, really, really loud. And then they're cutting this promo. It makes no sense. But then they try and do this like heaven and hell allegory. And these people covered in snakes, like really long snakes, like, oh yeah, sorry. Like anaconda style, maybe not anaconda style, tentacly, keep like popping up out of the water. There's 4 of them and it's WWE. And so it's like the most offensive thing in the world. They're like cutting the promo and they like are like, this is hell. And they like pop up like a gay person and like a feminist. And they're like, and like, I don't remember what the other 2 were, but it's something probably horribly offensive. And it's like, this is hell. If you're like liberal, you get eaten by snakes in the water or whatever. And these people look more fucked up. Like they have like fucked up makeup and they're covered in snakes and they keep getting waterboarded or I guess like dunked in the water. And then me and Elle just fucking lose it, right? And the actors or the wrestlers are really trying to get through their promo and like the audience is not into it. And me and Elle are really loudly like, again, we're like in the pool at this point. We're not interfering, but we're like pacing in the pool. Like, what the fuck is this? Okay, so their promo ends. God, their promo ends, they go away. And we're in the audience. They're like sitting on the edge of the pool. And I say, I don't even know if this makes sense, but in the dream, I say, it's like a reverse Muppet and they're just all nose. And then I swear to God, the 2 old guy Muppets or whatever, Waldorf and Statler, is that their name? Are in the audience. And they just start fucking cracking up. That's it. That's the end of my dream. So I think you understand my feelings about NXT 2.0 and the Cenobites. Oh, man.
Okay, so that dream justifies us doing this segment forever now.
Yeah, so I hate NXT 2.0, and it also looks like it's in a gym, so my subconscious was like, where's the pool? And then I was like, if NXT ever did a Cenobite thing, it would be sexy in like a WWE way and not in a fun Hellraiser way. And they would make the Cenobites the capital B bad guys. And this is the hell that liberals want, with feminists and queer people being drowned by snakes. While the old guys from the Muppets are like, this is bad.
It reminds me of something that Elle said earlier when you guys were talking about how modern everything has lost its sex. Even when it is portraying sex, it's oddly cold and calculated and very like FCC guidelined. An
idea of sexy.
Right.
But not like...
It has no sex in it.
The wetness of sex.
The wetness. You did keep saying the wetness.
Though this was particularly wet because they were literally in a pool.
And yet still none of it worked.
None of it worked.
None of it worked.
A thing that I really am hating about WWE or NXT 2.0 is specifically Toxic Attraction, which is this sexy faction that is completely told from the male gaze. And this was like, what if Cenobites were told from Vince McMahon's perspective? very happy that I'm on the same side as Waldorf and Statler, though. So.
Oh, I mean, perpetually, but yes.
Just to clarify, the nose is like if Squidward's nose got filled with more like water, so it was like big and droopy.
So near an elephant tusk, but not functional like one.
But more like...
So like a vestigial nose sack is what we're going for here?
Yeah, it's still sack-shaped, not trunk-shaped. Anyways, it's not just traditional nightmares in the Nightmare Corner. Just...
No, we are here for the abstract. We are here for what dances in your mind after viewing the ecstasy and pain.
Yeah, pleasure and pain. That's me watching WWE every week. So,
getting back to Hellraiser, now that you've had a nightmare and you talked about this like build up of you getting really worried about watching this before watching 2 of the movies and reading the books, where are we on the spooky scale for the book and 1 and 2 of Hellraiser?
I watched them back to back and read it very like bam, bam, bam.
So it feels more like one big thing to you.
Right. I don't think I can really divorce them, especially the book and the movie, the first movie, because they are very similar. It's just like more of like, here are the interior monologues, right? I would give it a 4. I think it's pretty fucking scary. Like, it didn't make me tremble and it didn't give me a traditional nightmare, but like it's like deeply in my psyche, right? And again, I never want to watch the rest of them because I like where I am, and it had an impact on me. And the bodies being ripped apart by the chains is pretty like fucking intense, right? Like it's the thing is intense, and the growth of Frank is intense in a very different way than seeing somebody's like body ripped apart by chains or like mutilated, which is part of the reason I'm nervous about the new one. Like, it definitely, I'm so excited about it. But like, again, what does somebody's body being ripped apart by chains look like with like modern cinema? I'm quite worried actually, but I'm going to definitely 100% see it. So I think, yeah, it resonated and was spooky enough to like burrow into my psyche that I would definitely give it a 4.
Do you want to watch them again sometime?
Hell yes.
Cool. Yeah.
I love them.
Nice.
I really love them. There hasn't been anything other than like sequels and stuff. So far, everybody's picking good ones. I like deeply love a lot of things.
And we're going to get to some newer stuff later
Yeah.
as well. It won't all just be spooky 30s and the 80s like you were talking about.
Hey, the 80s, I think, made the best horror films so far.
Definitely.
Or like the ones that are foundational, right?
Yes.
It makes sense to start season 1 and baby horror fan with foundational 80s stuff.
Especially in America. When
Yeah.
we start getting to Italian stuff, there's a bunch that happens in the 60s and 70s and older stuff. But big American horror movies like this, yeah, they
Right.
come up in the 80s.
And I know it's reductive to say that because I know there's like the Universal monster films and
There's a bunch of slasher flicks that happened in the 60s and 70s
but
as
when
well.
people think like horror, I feel like the big ones that people think of are those 80s touchstones.
Yeah, definitely.
At least with the capital P, capital C pop culture ones.
So you close your eyes, and when you think about Hellraiser, what is the image that sticks with you in your mind?
It's not so much one image in the first movie, but just Pinhead and his just casual delivery of the lines and the ferocity and intenseness of those lines, especially having read so much. I took a lot of notes while I was watching it, but I read a lot about Doug Bradley and him being like, Clive kept being, pull back. You don't have to do as much. You have no idea how good this looks. And you are already a powerful actor. Just pull back, pull back. Like, he didn't have to do a lot because he had, with the makeup, but also his meditative state that he went in when he was getting on, like, he was Pinhead. It was like... Critics a lot of times and people who don't watch pop culture-y stuff and like, oh, this is beneath me, often will be like, it's not very well acted or whatever. And that's fundamentally not true a lot of the times. But like, Doug Bradley is so good in, especially the first movie. It is a really powerful performance. And so I think just his line delivery, the like, just even though we have such sights to show you, like, it's both menacing but also welcoming, like, which is what it should be, right?
Anyone who's seen the movie, if you say that line like you just did, they hear it in
Yeah.
their heads. It's in there. It stays with you, definitely.
He sticks with me, which makes sense. Like, that's the Again, I thought he would be in the movie more, but it makes sense to me why he's the iconic figure that people were like, yeah, we need this guy, Pinhead. We want the replicas of him. We want the action figures. When we think Hellraiser, we think Pinhead because he did such a phenomenal job.
You don't think about any of the human characters, the Earthbound characters, even though they do drive most of what exists of a plot.
I mean, I'll always be thinking of Kirsty,
well,
but...
That's true. That's true. I mean, she's still around. She does conventions.
I know. I did a lot of research about her for personal reasons. In the 1988 movie, the second one, I mean, obviously, Bloody Julia in the white suit is super duper hot. But also, conversely, like, Kirsty wearing her skin, and when the skin rips off and it reveals to Kirsty just with like a light sheen of blood and a big toothy smile, like, that is a good twist. I did not see that coming. And I was like, oh, her arm's going to rip off or something. Something's going to happen. But like, it's definitely
just gonna be
Julia.
A straight to gloving.
Yeah. And it was like, oh, nope. It's Kirsty. She put on a dead woman's skin. She's metal as hell. I love her.
And then you're just happy for her. Like you said, like, I'm just happy for her.
Yeah. I will link this in our Patreon, but Chicago burlesque performer who specializes in horror burlesque, Red Rum, does this incredible Hellraiser 2 act with the skin suit and the white suit. So good.
Also does a Badass They Live act. Does
everything Red Rum does is incredible. And if you're not following Red Rum on Instagram and Twitter, like, and you call yourself a horror fan, like, you have to be following them. Spoiler, they'll be on later this year. But they're specifically their Hellraiser, which I had seen before at Gen Con one year. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I don't get this, but it's good because it's Red Rum. So boop-a-doop, this is fun. And then as soon as I started doing research, I emailed Rum and I was like, hey, do you have a video of this? Because I would like to watch it now that I have context. And like, it was such a different experience, which was cool. And then with the book, I think the first chapter, the Cenobites' first appearance, I talked about it a lot, about how Frank does like basically a real like religious ritual, but the way that they're presented as a lot more gender ambiguous, and they really do walk that line of like what they believe that everything that they're doing is pleasurable, but they understand that this like sad straight dude fucked up. And when Frank says like, but you're gonna show me pleasure, right? I can't remember the line. I don't have the book in front of me, but it's something like, the Cenobites smiled like a wicked smile and said, not as you understand it. And like, that scene is so good. It's perfect. And it's like, it's the opening chapter. It's perfect.
It's a great bumper for
the
book, the movies, the whole series. Yes.
Wicked smile. Oh, I'll show you something. So yeah, those are the scenes that stick with me. And if you're a fan of the movie but have never read the novella, I would recommend it. It's really good. Like we said, the Kirsty character is like a kind of away from the book. She's way better in the movie. She fucking rules in the movie. But other than that, everything else is pretty similar. And it is just like kind of getting interior monologues. And the way that they present things, I think only enhances the movie. It's excellent. I love Clive Barker. He rules. That's it. That's another episode. Spooky 30s. Like we said, if you want to follow Elle, you can follow them at Another Elle. Their socials will be linked and everything. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Stella_Cheeks.
If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Haberdasher9K.
You can follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at NYD Productions and use the hashtag Spooky30s with the 3 and the 0 to interact with this podcast specifically. Next episode, I'll be joined by Jenna Dalgetty, a horror writer and Chicago MC, and we'll be discussing the Scream franchise, which I'm actually kind of scared about because I have seen Scream 1 before, sort of, but it kind of haunted my childhood because I would go to sleepovers and people would be like, let's watch Scream. And I'd be like, I don't want to. And I just have heard it under my blanket and seen specific scenes and actually was really afraid of the first movie. So it will be interesting to watch this franchise that people love and is going through like a new, revival, I guess, because it's a lot of the same actors. So I'm talking really fast because I'm actually kind of nervous. Because this is one that I've experienced with that actually fucked me up as a kid. So anyways, we'll see what those nightmares look like. We'll see you next time. And remember, after 30 plus years of getting over my fears, monsters just make me horny now.
Spooky 30s is created by Stella Cheeks and produced by Bobby Hoffman for NYD Productions. Our show theme is made by Resonate_music, and our show art is by Lauren Moran.